On a winter morning in 2010, in Thach Tam Village, a small village nestled among the majestic mountains of northern Vietnam, the biting cold enveloped everything. A thick mist shrouded the pathways, plunging the village into an eerie silence, as if nature itself was trying to conceal a secret. The wind howled through the bamboo groves, lashing against the thatched roofs, blending with the distant crowing of roosters. The familiar tranquility of the countryside had taken on a heavy, haunting air. At the heart of the village stood an ancient banyan tree, hundreds of years old, a sacred place where the villagers believed the spirits of their ancestors resided. Under its dense canopy, a strange scene was unfolding within the ghostly mist. Huddled beneath the sprawling branches sat four little girls, curled up together like tiny birds battered by a storm. They wore tattered clothes, their small hands numb with cold, their faces smudged with dirt. Leading the group was Lan, a frail-looking 10-year-old girl, yet her eyes burned with an unusual determination. Standing tall, she spread her arms wide, shielding her younger siblings, Hoa, Lei and Bi Lin, who were only 5 and 3 years old. Lan's gaze was both wary and filled with a profound fear. Each time an adult approached, she instinctively took a step back, clutching her siblings tightly, as if ready to fight the entire world to protect her little family. No one knew where these children had come from. The first villagers to pass by stopped in their tracks, stunned. They whispered among themselves, "Who are these children? Why are they sitting under the tree in this freezing weather? Are they lost? But why is no one looking for them?" Anyone who passed by couldn't help but be stunned by the scene beneath the banyan tree. In the village, Lan dashed forward like a tiny flame flickering in the winter night. Nearby, Mr. Duong, the man who lived closest to the tree, rushed breathlessly toward the commune police station. Panting, he shouted urgently, "Mr. Quan, come quickly! There are 4 abandoned children under the banyan tree. In this freezing weather, I don't know if they can survive." At the edge of the village, in a small house quietly nestled by the forest, Mr. Quan, a former border soldier in his 60s, was sipping a hot cup of tea, trying to ward off the biting morning cold. After years away from the border, he had chosen a solitary life, deeply connected to this small village. Upon hearing the news, Mr. Quan swiftly grabbed his worn wool coat. His steps were quick yet steady. When he arrived, the sight of the 4 children beneath the banyan tree felt like a dagger cutting through his heart. Their innocent eyes were filled with confusion, their tiny hands clung tightly to one another, and in front of them stood little Lan, her gaze both fearful and unwavering. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene. Something deep within him, long buried by the passing years, suddenly stirred awake. The thick mist still blanketed the area, turning the landscape before him into a hazy painting. Yet it wasn't hard to make out the strange sight under the ancient banyan tree. 4 frail, small children in tattered clothes, huddled together on the cold ground. Their tiny hands clenched tightly, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and helplessness, as if awaiting some terrible fate. The winter wind blew, rustling the banyan leaves, mingling with the trembling breaths of the children who were bracing themselves against the harshness of destiny. Amid the freezing air, Lan whispered a sorrowful story. The oldest of the children, Lan, around 10 years old, was frail, yet her eyes burned with an unusual determination. She stood protectively in front of her 3 younger siblings, Hoa, Lei and Bi Lin. Her tangled hair fluttered gently in the wind, and her chapped lips were tightly pressed together. The moment she saw the adults approaching, she immediately spread her arms wide, shielding her siblings like a protective barrier. That gesture made Mr. Quan's heart tighten. "Don't take us away!" Lan's voice was weak, but filled with unwavering resolve. Her tear-filled eyes locked onto Mr. Quan's, silently pleading for help. "We just need to stay together. Please don't separate us." Her words didn't just take Mr. Kwan by surprise, they left everyone around her speechless. A villager let out a quiet sigh, eyes filled with concern. The social worker, a middle-aged woman in a thick coat, shook her head. Her face showed clear sorrow, but her voice remained steady, as if she was trying to suppress her emotions. "We can't leave the children here. According to regulations, they must be placed in social welfare centers. But no center can take all 4 of them at once. They will have to be separated." Her words struck Lan like a dagger to the heart. Her eyes filled with despair. Without a word, she collapsed onto her knees, wrapping her arms tightly around her siblings. Bi Lin, only 3 years old, clung to her sister's hand, wide eyes brimming with tears. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. Hua and Lei pressed closer to their sister, as if searching for even the faintest sense of safety in this cold, indifferent world. "No, we'd rather die together than be torn apart. Don't take us away from each other." Lan screamed through her tears, her voice breaking, echoing in the heavy silence. That scene dragged Mr. Kwan back to a memory he had buried for decades, the day he and his younger brother were separated after the war. Each was sent to a different place. The hunger, the loneliness, and the unbearable pain had haunted him his entire life. Slowly, Mr. Kwan stepped forward, each step weighed down by the burden of old wounds and memories resurfacing. When he finally reached Lan, he knelt down, his calloused hands, worn from time, gently reaching out. Mr. Kwan gently placed his hand on the little girl's shoulder. His aged but warm eyes met Lan's fearful gaze. In a deep, reassuring voice, he spoke, his words carrying the weight of a promise. "I won't let anyone separate you. If no place will take all 4 of you, then I will." His words were like a small flame igniting in the bitter cold. Lan looked up at him, a faint glimmer of hope flickering in her eyes, but the people around them could not hide their shock. A villager blurted out, "Mr. Kwan, are you serious? How can you take care of 4 children on your own?" The social worker shook her head in disapproval. "Mr. Kwan, this is not that simple. You wouldn't just need to prove financial stability, you'd also have to prove that you can be a father and care for them properly. This is an enormous responsibility." Voices of doubt and protest filled the air, but Mr. Kwan remained steadfast. He turned to look at Lan, then at the 3 other children, trembling in the cold. Straightening his back, his eyes shone with determination. "I don't need anyone to believe in me. I only know that these children need a home, and I cannot turn my back on them." His words silenced the crowd. Standing beneath the ancient banyan tree, Mr. Kwan, a man who had weathered the storms of life, stood like an unshakable pillar. His heart was filled with kindness, his resolve unwavering. He was ready to face any challenge to protect these children he had just met. A new chapter began in Mr. Kwan's small home, filling it with sounds he had not heard in years. The soft pitter-patter of tiny footsteps each morning, hushed whispers, quiet sobs in the dead of night, and bursts of joyous laughter as the children played. The once silent house now felt alive, brought back to life by the warmth of a newfound family. Mr. Kwan added 2 simple bamboo beds in the corner of the living room, a space that became their dining area, sleeping quarters, and playground. He gathered old blankets from all over the village to keep the children warm. Every morning, before anyone else woke up, he would rise early to light the fire, ensuring the house was warm when the children opened their eyes. The soft clatter of a boiling pot, the gentle crackling of dry firewood, and the cheerful calls of the children filled the little home with new energy and life. Lan had already taken on the role of an older sister. Despite her young age, she understood her responsibilities. She woke up at dawn, silently sweeping the house and caring for her siblings. Sometimes, while sweeping the yard, she would softly call out, "Lei, don't run outside. Hua, get me the bucket." Little Hoa, only 3, often cried at night, longing for their mother. Each time, Lan would sit beside her, whispering words of comfort. "I'm here. It's okay. Go to sleep now. We have to help Grandpa in the garden tomorrow." Lei, 5 years old, was endlessly mischievous. If left unattended for even a moment, she might tip over a water bucket that Grandpa had just carried, or accidentally break a bowl. Whenever she got scolded, she would pout, her eyes welling with tears. "I just wanted to help Grandpa." 3-year-old Lin was the most attached to Mr. Kwan. She followed him everywhere, from lighting the stove and watering the plants to mending old clothes. Her tiny hands often clung tightly to his, as if afraid he would disappear if she let go. At dinner time, the family sat around an old wooden table. Under the flickering oil lamp, their meal consisted of a pot of plain rice, a small plate of pickled vegetables, and a bowl of thin soup made from garden greens. Whenever Mr. Kwan scooped rice, the children hesitated, never daring to ask for more. Lan often secretly gave part of her small portion to Hoa, pretending she was already full so no one would notice. One evening, Mr. Kwan happened to see Lan quietly pushing her bowl of rice toward Hoa. The little girl forced a smile. "I'm not hungry. You eat." That moment tightened his heart. He felt helpless, seeing his children go hungry. His calloused hands gripped his chopsticks tightly, his gaze filled with sorrow as he looked at the children. After they had fallen asleep, he sat alone by the oil lamp, lost in thought. Memories of his own childhood flooded his mind, of a frail, starving boy struggling to survive the war. "I have to do something," he told himself. "They can't live like this forever. They need to be fed, kept warm, and given a better future." From that day on, Mr. Kwan began taking on extra laborious jobs in the village. By day, he toiled in the fields, tending to every row of vegetables and every chicken. By night, he worked at a nearby construction site, hauling cement bags and bricks. The hands that once held a gun were now rough from labor. Despite the exhaustion, every time he returned home and saw Lan's hopeful eyes or little Lin's innocent smile, his heart felt light. To him, they were no longer just children in need of shelter. They had become family, the only reason he kept going. News of Mr. Kwan adopting 4 orphaned children spread quickly throughout Thach Tam Village. It became the talk of the early morning markets, the conversations beneath the banyan tree, and the discussions over family dinners. In the small village, every little matter easily became a topic of gossip. "Mr. Kwan just wants attention. He can barely feed himself, yet now he's taking in all these children." An elderly woman sighed as she sat by the fire. "Exactly," a middle-aged man chimed in. "He's lived alone his entire life. If this isn't just for show, then what is?" Before long, these thoughtless words reached Mr. Kwan's ears. He neither defended himself nor showed any reaction. But at night, as he sat by the dim oil lamp, he couldn't help but feel the weight in his heart. It wasn't just the village gossip. Greater pressure came from the local authorities. At a meeting in the commune office, the news of Mr. Kwan adopting 4 children was brought up for discussion. Mrs. Thoa, head of the Social Affairs Committee, stood up, her voice firm. "Mr. Kwan is a former soldier. I don't deny his kindness. But we must face reality. He has no stable income, no experience raising children, especially 4 young girls. We are talking about their future. We cannot base such a decision purely on goodwill. If Mr. Kwan cannot prove he is capable, this matter must be reconsidered." Her sharp words silenced the room. A few officials nodded in agreement. Their gazes, like invisible daggers, made Mr. Kwan feel as though the entire world had turned against him. That night he sat on the porch, gazing at the starry sky. Memories came flooding back, the war years, when he and his younger brother were separated, when he stood at the brink of life and death, hoping someone would reach out and help him. Inside, Lan softly hummed a lullaby to put little Lin to sleep. Her voice, though quiet, carried a miraculous comfort in the darkness. Mr. Kwan turned to look through the window. Under the warm glow of the oil lamp, Lan sat there, her eyes filled with determination, yet laced with worry. When their eyes met, she smiled gently. That smile, those eyes, the sound of Hoa and Lei's giggles from the corner of the room, they were his strength to endure everything. He told himself, "People may doubt me, but I cannot let these children lose faith. They need me, and I need them. This family cannot be torn apart again." From that moment, Mr. Kwan began to prepare. He sought ways to convince the commune officials, proving that he could provide for the children. He took on extra work to increase his income, learned childcare skills from an elderly neighbor, and taught the children how to be independent. Though the gossip continued, he paid no attention. Each day for him was another step forward. Each hopeful gaze from the children was a source of motivation. Nothing could replace the seemingly endless days of tension in Mr. Kwan's life. The weight of public opinion and government scrutiny pressed down on his aging shoulders like a mountain. He remained strong in front of the children, but at night he would sit silently on the porch, gazing into the darkness, wondering if he could truly overcome everything to keep a home for the 4 children. One winter afternoon, as icy winds rustled through the trees, Mr. Kwan was diligently patching up an old coat for little Hoa when an unexpected knock on the door startled him. He looked up, slightly surprised. Hardly anyone ever visited him at this hour. When he opened the door, he saw Mrs. Mai, a widow from the village, standing on his porch, holding a steaming pot of porridge. She was wrapped in a thick wool sweater, her face kind yet firm. Without waiting for him to say anything, she stepped inside and placed the pot on the table. The warmth from the porridge spread through the small house, pushing away the winter chill. "I know you're trying," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "Don't worry about what people say. If you need help, I'm here." Mr. Kwan was momentarily taken aback. This was the first time in months that someone had willingly come to offer support. Looking into her sincere eyes, he gave a slight nod, his voice low but filled with gratitude. "Thank you. I truly don't know what to say." Mrs. Mai said nothing more. She simply ladled the porridge into bowls and placed them before the children. Lan, Hoa, Lei, and little Lin sat quietly in the corner, watching her with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. When Mrs. Mai smiled and handed Lan a bowl of hot porridge, the girl carefully took it, lowering her head as she murmured, "Thank you, ma'am." From that day on, Mrs. Mai visited frequently, bringing not just warm meals, but also the kindness of a compassionate heart. She didn't come with empty words of advice. She helped in practical ways. "These children need more than just food and clothes," she said one evening, as the family gathered under the oil lamp's glow. "They need to feel loved and protected. You're doing your best, but it's too much for one person. If we work together, things will get better." She taught Mr. Kwan how to cook nutritious meals with whatever simple ingredients he had, mostly vegetables from the garden and small portions of meat or fish. She showed him how to cut fabric to patch up worn-out clothes, how to soothe Lin when she cried at night, and how to handle Lei's mischief when she spilled an entire bucket of water. Lan quickly grew fond of Mrs. Mai. Every time she arrived, the girl would rush to greet her, eyes shining. "Mrs. Mai, can you teach me how to make sweet potato pudding today? My siblings loved it last time." Lei and Lin clung to her, eagerly chattering about their day, while shy little Hoa, though reserved, began to smile each time she entered the house. After the children had fallen asleep, Mrs. Mai often sat with Mr. Kwan by the fire. She shared stories of the hardships she endured raising her child alone after her husband passed away, the burden of public scrutiny, and the lessons she had learned from life. Raising a child alone isn't easy, especially in poverty. But I believe that as long as there is love, any hardship can be overcome, she said, her gaze deep yet unwavering. Mr. Kwan, you've been through war, faced death. Raising 4 children is difficult, but I believe you can do it. Mr. Kwan remained silent, his aged eyes fixed on the flickering flames. After a moment, his voice dropped. I'm just afraid that I don't have the strength to give them what they need. Mrs. Mai placed a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder. What you're doing is already so much. These children don't need a perfect person. They just need someone who will always be there for them, and I will always be here to help you whenever you need. With Mrs. Mai's help, Mr. Kwan's small home gradually became warmer in both senses of the word. The tattered clothes were neatly mended and stacked in the cupboard. The meals, though simple, were always hot and filled with care. The once cold and empty house was now filled with laughter. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Mr. Kwan looked at the children chatting happily with Mrs. Mai. His heart overflowed with happiness. For the first time in years, he felt a strong belief. This family, though unconventional and imperfect, would make it through anything together. Though life in the small home had become cozier with Mrs. Mai's help, challenges continued to arise. Heavy labor, pressure from the authorities, and the constant worry about the children's future took a toll on Mr. Kwan's health. He never let it show, working tirelessly day and night to ensure he didn't let the children down. One morning, while working in the fields, Mr. Kwan suddenly felt dizzy. His grip on the hoe loosened, sweat beading on his forehead. He tried to steady himself, but before he could call for help, he collapsed onto the cold ground. The villagers rushed him home. When he awoke, the 4 children were gathered around his bed, eyes brimming with tears. Lan, the eldest, grasped his hand tightly, her eyes red, searching for reassurance. Though her voice trembled, it was filled with determination. Dad Kwan, we'll help you. Please don't leave us. You need to rest, and we'll take care of things. We promise to be good, to not make you worry anymore. Her words cut through the darkness in his mind like a ray of light. Looking into Lan's eyes, he saw a maturity far beyond her years. He realized that even though they were just children, their love and determination were enough to soothe any pain. From that day on, Mr. Kwan changed his approach. He no longer carried the burden alone. Instead, he taught the children how to be independent. Lan became his right hand, cleaning the house, tending the garden, and preparing simple meals for her siblings. Though tired, she never complained, quietly working so Mr. Kwan could rest. Shy little Hawa learned how to gather firewood and start a fire, something she had always been too scared to do before. Rate, the most mischievous child, was assigned the task of taking care of the chickens and collecting eggs. At first, she frequently dropped the eggs while playing, but over time, she learned to be more careful. Lin, the youngest, couldn't sit still. Her favorite task was helping Mr. Kwan water the garden, her tiny hands always struggling to carry small buckets, even though sometimes she could only bring half a bucket at a time. Every evening after dinner, Mr. Kwan would sit with the children and tell them stories about his time as a soldier, about battles he fought and comrades who sacrificed their lives. He also made time to teach them useful, small skills, like how to mend a torn shirt or how to tie a water bucket tightly to a cart. Thanks to the joint effort of the small family, the atmosphere in the house became more joyful. The house, once just a place to live, now felt like a true home, where everyone shared their sorrows, joys, and even dreams. One evening, Lan sat by Mr. Kwan's bed, the oil lamp flickering in her eyes. "Dad Kwan, when I grow up, I want to be a teacher and teach other children, but I also want to stay by your side forever, to take care of you like you've taken care of us." Mr. Kwan looked at Lan, his eyes glowing with silent pride. He gently patted her head and said softly, "You'll do it, Lan. I believe in you and in your siblings. Together, we will overcome everything." From then on, Mr. Kwan was not just a father, but also a teacher and friend to the children. The small house, though modest, became a place where lessons of love, sharing and patience were taught and learned every day. And Mr. Kwan, with all his love, knew that he was not just giving the children a home, but also a future. On the day the decision for the custody of the 4 children was to be made, the meeting hall was packed like never before. Villagers of all ages gathered to attend the important session. Every seat was taken, and many had to stand along the walls or squeeze outside the windows to hear the news about Mr. Kwan adopting the 4 orphan children. His story spread not only through Thach Tam Village, but also throughout the region. The atmosphere in the hall was tense. Above, Mrs. Thoa, the head of the social work committee, stood up with a serious expression. She looked toward Mr. Kwan, who was sitting in the front row, calm, but with his hands slightly clenched on his knees. After a moment of silence, Mrs. Thoa's voice rang out, clear and decisive. Mr. Kwan, we do not deny your kindness and sacrifices, but kindness cannot replace the necessary conditions for raising children. How long do you think you can provide for these 4 children? What will you use to ensure their future? Her question spread like a wave across the hall, causing some in the crowd to frown. A wave of murmurs began to rise, with many in the hall showing signs of doubt. How could he possibly support all 4 children? It's hard enough to support himself, let alone take care of the kids. Mr. Kwan stood up, his gaze silently sweeping over the crowd before fixing directly on Mrs. Thoa. His posture, though slightly bent from years of hard work, still exuded strength and determination. His voice, though not loud, was clear with every word. I don't have much. I am not wealthy nor perfect, but I have a heart to love them, and I am ready to do everything to protect them. We lost our family when we were young, and I know how great that pain is. I don't want these children to suffer the same. He paused, took a deep breath, and continued, his eyes fixed on the corner of the hall where the 4 children sat closely together, their faces filled with worry. You may doubt me, but look into their eyes. They don't need a rich father. They don't need a perfect father. They just need someone who will never abandon them, and I promise I will be that person. The hall fell silent. No one spoke, but in the eyes of many, a growing sense of emotion could be seen. Mr. Kwan's sincere and simple words had touched their hearts. Unexpectedly, from the back row, Mrs. Mai stood up and walked forward with confidence. Her voice rang out clearly. Mr. Kwan is not alone. I will stand by him. I've seen what he's done for these 4 children, and I believe he's capable. If necessary, I'll help him care for them. This time, the murmurs were not of doubt, but of support. One villager stood up and said, That's right, if Mrs. Mai helps, Mr. Kwan can definitely handle it. Another person added, I think we should give him a chance. No one can love these children more than Mr. Kwan. Applause broke out, first sparingly, then spreading throughout the hall. One by one, villagers expressed their support for Mr. Kwan and Mrs. Mai. After some discussion, the village leader stood up and declared, Mr. Kwan will be the guardian of these 4 children. We hope he will keep his promise and take good care of them. As the small family left the hall under the setting sun, the 4 children gathered around Mr. Kwan, their eyes gleaming with joy. Lan held his hand tightly and whispered, Dad Kwan, I knew you could do it. Mr. Kwan smiled, his eyes full of relief and pride. In his heart, and in the hearts of those around him, a new hope was kindled, that love, determination, and kindness would always be the guiding light, even though the road ahead would be full of challenges. 14 years have passed since that fateful day. Thach Tam Village has changed a lot, but Mr. Kwan's small house remains a place full of warmth. The laughter of the children and the ancient banyan tree, where Mr. Kwan first met the 4 children, still stands proudly in the village, a witness to the heartfelt journey of this special family. Lan, the determined girl from years ago, is now a dedicated teacher at the village school. She not only teaches but also shares the story of her family with her students, a story of love, patience, and sacrifice that she grew up with alongside the other children in the village. The children love her not only for her gentleness but also for the way she inspires them, helping them dream of a brighter future. Hua, the shy little girl, is now a nurse in the village. It's her dedicated care that keeps the villagers healthy. She often organizes free health checkup sessions for the poor, as a way of giving back the goodness that life has given her. Li, the most mischievous child in the house, is now a skilled craftswoman. Her bamboo and rattan creations, from baskets to charming lamps, are loved by people both inside and outside the village. Li not only provides an income for her family, but also helps make Thach Tam Village famous for its traditional craftsmanship. Lin, the youngest, is now a 17-year-old girl full of life. Lin became an agricultural engineer to help the village develop new crop varieties. She still clings to Mr. Kwan, just like when she was little, and used to help him care for the small garden behind the house. Mr. Kwan, though in his 70s, still maintains a sharp mind. He no longer does heavy labor, but his vegetable garden remains the pride of the village. In the evenings, he often sits on the porch, telling stories to the village children. To him, family is not just the 4 children he adopted, but also the community that helped him overcome his struggles. Mrs. Mai, his companion, is now officially Grandma Mai to the whole family. She not only helps Mr. Kwan care for the children, but also keeps the family spirit alive with warm meals and valuable advice. In a small ceremony at the village schoolyard, under the shade of the banyan tree, Mr. Kwan's family, along with the villagers of Thach Tam, held a heartfelt Thanksgiving event. Lan stood before everyone, her voice full of emotion. "We wouldn't be standing here today if it weren't for the love of Dad Kwan, Grandma Mai, and the entire Thach Tam village. Dad taught us that family is not just about blood relations, but about love, kindness, and sacrifice. We are grateful to call this place home." The applause rang out, shaking the banyan tree's leaves. Under the setting sun, Mr. Kwan looked at his children, his eyes filled with pride. A life full of challenges had brought him to this moment, a moment when he knew the seeds of love he had sown had grown into a strong forest. And there, in peaceful Thach Tam Village, love and kindness continued to spread like gentle winds across the land. This story is a heartfelt journey of love and compassion, where family is no longer just a blood tie, but is built on sacrifice and sharing. Through the image of Mr. Kwan, an elderly veteran, and the 4 orphaned children. The story affirms that strong will, unity, and belief can overcome all adversities. Love and determination have lit the way to a future, even though the road ahead is full of challenges. Thank you for listening to this meaningful story. Continue joining us to explore life lessons that inspire and help open new doors in your thinking.